talk about is very important to your projects, and that is the four constraints of scope, schedule, budget, resources. Now, resources can be material, equipment, labor, or funding. So when you're doing a project for a fixed scope, you're going to have a budget, schedule, and resources that match. And you have to keep this in balance. Right? So you're always looking at these four constraints. And when one of these constraints changes, you've got to go back and take a look at the other three and see how they change as well. And then you're going to have to make, if they do change, you're going to have to do something to get everything back in balance again. And don't forget, you're going to want some type of paper trail or be able to audit why did we do this change. So we have change notices and work orders and follow some type of procedure to get everything back in balance. As a very, very simple example of what I'm talking about, we had a project where we had to replace 2 emergency generators in a refinery. They were steam driven, never really worked very well. Went through the project life cycle. The stakeholders determined that what we needed was 14 separate diesel generators, 1 for each unit in the refinery. We prepared all the scope documentation, the funding documentation for it, gave it to management. It was in the value of like $7 million. Well, management looked at the risk of not doing it, okay? And then they looked at their spending plan. And then they came back to them and said, well, I can't give you $7 million, but I'll give you 3. What can I get for $3 million? Well, we then had to go back to our scope, schedule, budget, resources, figure out what we could get for $3 million, resubmit the documentation, and got it approved. With your restraints, the 4 constraints, you have to realize that vendors and contractors have the same thing. So when you go to them with your scope, right, they will start looking at the constraints of scope, schedule, budget, resources. If you're managing, say, 3 or 4 different projects, each one of these ones has a scope, schedule, budget, resource relationship, and you have to keep them all in balance as you go along. If you work in a facility, just to say a single facility, they all have capital budgets. Engineering manager, engineering superintendent maintains it. Say you have a capital budget of like $250 million. Well, your engineering superintendent manages that, and for that $250 million, he has a scope, schedule, budget, resources that matches it. If you work for a company that has several facilities, say in North America, you're going to have a vice president of North American operations, and his budget, capital budget, might be like $1 billion, and for that $1 billion, he's going to have a scope, schedule, budget, resources that reflects it. And if you work for the bigger companies that are worldwide, they may have, like a capital budget of like $7 billion, and for that $7 billion, there's going to be a scope, schedule, budget, resources that matches it. Now, not all projects work okay, and things happen, and things go bump in the middle of the night. And when that happens, management has a scope, schedule, budget, resource relationship that they're trying to keep in balance. And if you're in a facility and something happened in your facility, they may not want to go back to corporate to get more money, so they'll start cutting projects. And you may be working on a project that's borderline rate of return, but because we need the money, right, the projects get canceled. You're sitting there minding your own business, and all of a sudden your project disappears. Because what management is doing is trying to get their scope, schedule, budget, resources back in balance. So you have to keep this in mind all the time, every day. All your projects have these 4 constraints. People always looking for changes in scope, or different things happen, or your resources, equipment is late, purchasing doesn't do the job, whatever it is. These constraints are constantly changing, so you're always looking at them, always trying to keep them in balance.